After 9 years of the NDP Liberals, the majority of young Canadians have now abandoned the dream of home ownership. While housing starts fail to keep up with Canada's population growth, the Americans are building 4 times more housing per new resident. Conservatives have announced a plan to axe the federal sales tax on new homes, and we have called on the provinces to do the same. Our plan means more housing and savings for young Canadians who are desperately trying to enter the housing market. Will the NDP Liberals reignite the dream of homeownership and axe the federal GST on housing?
Here.
That would help tremendously.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
The list is growing, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday we learned in the Toronto Star that the MP for Kamloops on the Conservative side has joined many other Conservative colleagues to advocate for programs that their leader wants to cut. Programs like the Housing Accelerator Fund that are going to lead to more home building in his community and communities across the country, Mr. Speaker. They want to make these cuts. They have no vision on housing. Therefore, they have no vision on the future for Canada, Mr. Speaker. It's not serious.
I ask the Honourable Member for Kamloops, Thompson Caribou, as well as the Member for Coast of Bays, Central, Notre Dame, to please not take the floor unless they are recognized by the Speaker. I thank the Honourable Members. The Honourable Member from Battlefords, Lloydminster.
Speaker, that wannabe minister is so desperately clinging to their $8 billion failed Liberal housing photo op program that has built 0 houses. Policy commitment made in the past 2 decades. And those aren't my words, Mr. Speaker. That's what the West End Home Builders Association has said. And the Canadian Real Estate Association also called it a positive step towards making home ownership more attainable for Canadians. Will the NDP Liberals listen to the experts and axe the federal sales tax on housing?
That would help out a lot of people, man. Pierre's standing up and barking at Trudeau.
Housing, infrastructure and communities.
It's a difficult subject for them, Mr. Speaker, obviously. The MP for Kamloops, the MP for Simcoe North, the MP for Central Okanagan, the MP, and he's the best friend of the Conservative leader, the MP for St. Albert Edmonton, Mr. Speaker, went behind the back of the Conservative leader to advocate for the Accelerator Fund that's going to lead to more home building. In this House of Commons, on social media, they parrot their leader's talking points, but they don't believe in those talking points, evidently, Mr. Speaker, because they're advocating for good government programs that are going to get more homes built for Canadians.
The Honourable Member from Hastings, Lennox and Addington.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of NDP Liberals, they are not worth the cost of housing, and the majority of young Canadians are pointing to this government's failure to manage the economy as the reason their dreams of home ownership are dashed. The Conservatives have a plan. Scrapping the GST on new home sales will save young Canadians tens of thousands of dollars on new homes, and the Conservative leader already wrote the premiers asking them to match his pledge provincially. Mr. Speaker, will the NDP Liberals axe the federal GST on housing so more young Canadians can afford a home?
The Honourable Parliamentary
Conservatives just simply want to help Canadians, man.
Speaker, I've answered the matter already, and on this issue of housing, she ought to look 1 seat ahead of her to the MP for Peterborough. Earlier today, there was a 2-hour filibuster in the House of Commons committee responsible for housing, where we could have actually talked about housing, but we had to listen to the Conservatives filibuster for 2 hours, as I say, because they were trying to defend their colleague, who only a few days ago said that homelessness and homeless people and poverty lead to crime inevitably, Mr. Speaker. They made a natural connection between the two, blaming the poor for crime in Canada. It's unacceptable. We got to deal with stigma, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lennox, Hastings and Addington.
Let me be clear and call out the facts on the failures of these Liberals. The Liberals' own housing advisor said it was hard to deny that the Housing Accelerator Fund is turning out to be nothing more than a heist of tax dollars flowing from the feds to the municipalities. In contrast, the Conservative plan will apply to every single new home build, regardless if it's in downtown Toronto or in Bancroft. The Conservative plan will take power from the pens of bureaucrats to the hammers of builders. Mr. Speaker, will this government endorse the Conservative plan to scrap scrap the tax on, to scrap the GST on housing? Yes or no?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing.
More empty slogans from the Conservative side, Mr. Speaker. But you know what's not empty? You know what's real? The example of the Conservative leader who only months ago went down to encampments and filled people in their most vulnerable state. That's right. Who before that visited a home of a working class person, a server, and called it a shack, Mr. Speaker. Yep. So is it any surprise that the MP for Peterborough looks at poverty as something that's caused by those on the street, that points to the poor and makes them responsible for issues of criminality? We have to deal with stigma if we're going to deal with the homelessness crisis. They're not serious.
The Honourable Member from Kamloops, Thompson and Caribou.
There was chaos, yelling, screaming, running for cover. And no, Mr. Speaker, I'm not talking about the last Liberal caucus meeting. I'm talking about a police chase that happened in downtown Toronto.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Like the scene from a movie. Police chasing two people reportedly on bail. Rather than take accountability, this minister's response, do this, blame other people, blame the provinces. When will the Prime Minister and this Justice Minister stand in their place and take accountability for their failed catch and release policy?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk about accountability. There are currently 700 fewer police officers working in the City of Toronto today than when I was the police chief only 9 years ago. Mr. Speaker, there's been a 23% reduction in police per population in Toronto over those 9 years. And Mr. Speaker, how did that happen? 2 consecutive Conservative mayors under the unwatchful eye of a Conservative premier allowed a hiring freeze and those cuts to take place. If you want to look for accountability, look in the mirror.
Oh, look. What else happened in the past 9 years, dumbass? Trudeau.
The Liberals' $9 million cover-up of their luxury condo purchase in New York City is now unraveling. Newly uncovered government documents show that the Prime Minister's media pal, Tom Clark, lied before a parliamentary committee. Wow. He had previously said that he didn't weigh in on the purchase, but now we know he in fact said that it required urgent replacement. After 9 years of these NDP Liberals, they're not worth the cost, the corruption, or lies from their insiders. So will the Prime Minister fire his buddy Tom Clark for lying to Canadians?
Hear, hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I just went to the OGO committee and I answered all his questions for an hour, and we've been talking about this issue. First,
Canada's action figure, Melanie Joly.
For money in this transaction, $7 million will be refunded. Second, all the process were, of course, followed. And finally, we don't fall into the character assassination that he's doing about an important consul. But not only that, at the time of the U.S. election today, when all Canadians are looking down south to see what's going to happen, we need to invest in the American-Canadian relationship, and that's exactly what we're doing, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Leeds Grenville, Thousand Islands and Vito Lakes.
These economic vandals bought a $9 million condo in Manhattan for the Prime Minister's buddy, and they're subsidizing his rent to the tune of $40,000 per month after doubling rents for Canadians, doubling mortgages for Canadians, and presiding over a country for 9 years with homeless encampments springing up under bridges in communities from coast to coast to coast. If that's not bad enough, Canadians are lined up at food banks in record numbers. 25% of Canadians don't know where their next meal is coming from. If they won't fire Clark for lying, will they fire him for blowing $9 million? The
Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Apparently, Mr. Clark was good enough for the Conservative when he was moderating their leadership race, but that's another issue. That's another issue, Mr. Speaker. What I want to say today is, as Canadians are looking down south to see what's going on and to take act of the will of the American people, we will invest in the relationship between Canada and the U.S., contrary to what the Conservatives want to do. And of course, we won't take the recommendation of having an official residence outside of Manhattan. Why? Because only 2 countries in the world do so, Bangladesh and Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from... Order. That includes the honourable member from South Shore, St. Margaret.
At least he's not muting the microphone. I'll give him that,
Honourable
man.
member from Calgary, Midnapore.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, Tom Clark lied to committee, saying that he didn't know about the purchase of a $9 million condo. The Minister of Foreign Affairs also said she didn't know about the purchase of a $9 million condo. She also said she didn't know that a Canadian warship was next to Russian warships in the port of Havana. She also said that she didn't know that a senior global affairs official attended a Russian embassy party. Mr. Speaker, isn't that the role of the Minister of Foreign Affairs to know?
Yeah. Mélanie Joly doesn't know anything.
Minister for Foreign Affairs.
I know I have a lot of time for the member opposite because she used to be the consul in Dallas, and she knows how much it's important to be investing in her diplomatic network in the U.S. So, of course, we'll continue to do so. We'll continue to invest across our consulates, across also the U.S., because if there's one country in the world who knows about the Americans, who knows about the U.S., it's Canada.
She's so weird, man. She's a LARPer. She's a live-action role player.
From Richmond Centre.
Mr. Speaker, previous Conservative government has brought cuts and challenges that left many veterans struggling, particularly in British Columbia, and we don't want to see this happen again. Our Liberal government has worked diligently to address these issues. As we reflect on these changes, let us remember that our commitment to veterans must be unwavering. Can the Minister of Citizen Services share how our government has expanded our reach to better support veterans from coast to coast to coast?
Well, veterans do not like
From
the Liberals.
Citizen Services.
I'll tell you that.
Mr. Speaker, do you remember when the Conservatives campaigned on shutting down veterans' offices? Yep. Or do you remember when they promised to increase the retirement age to 67? Well, of course you don't, because Conservatives never actually say what they're actually going to do. It's why they speak in slogans. They hope no one would notice that they shut down veterans' offices in Corner Brook, Sydney, Charlottetown, Thunder Bay, Windsor, Saskatoon, Brandon, Kelowna, and Prince George. Mr. Speaker, our government reopened all those offices, and we opened a new office in Surrey, because when we say that we support veterans, unlike Conservatives, we actually mean it.
Mary Ng standing up. Bro, sit down.
After 9 years and 3 U.S. presidents, the NDP, this NDP Liberal Prime Minister has failed to get a deal with the Americans on softwood lumber, while our previous Conservative government got it done within 80 days. 2 more mills in BC are closing because of this Prime Minister's incompetence.
Yes, sir.
Wayne and Marie Harder have seen their logging businesses in Fort St. John destroyed by these NDP Liberals. I asked Wayne yesterday, who would you fire in this NDP Liberal government? Wayne's answer, all of them. Will the Prime Minister do the right thing for Forestry families and call an election today?
There you go. Way to represent PG, my guy.
I'm going to ask once again the colleagues at the end, particularly the member from New Westminster, Burnaby, and Timmins St. James, Bay James, to please not take the floor unless recognized by the Speaker. The Honourable Minister for International Trade.
Mr. Speaker, I want to say to forestry industry workers and those in the sector how important they are to Canada's economy, and indeed how important they are to building affordable homes in this country. I know that we continue to work very hard and we have said that getting a deal is indeed the best way to go. But I think what Canadians want to know is why it is that on this side of the House, when we renegotiated NAFTA, on this side of the House, when we stood up to defend tariffs against steel.
Bro, even her poppy's made in China.
We are always standing up for workers. What they are doing on the other side of the House.
Look at that. That's not even a real poppy. It's made in China.
The Honourable Member for Miramichi, Grand Lake.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, the NDP Liberals are not worth the cost to Canada's economy. While the Prime Minister dismissed his failure on softwood lumber as a small issue, the U.S. slapped a 14.5% tariff on Canada. This negatively impacts the 24,000 New Brunswick forestry workers. The Prime Minister has failed with 3 straight U.S. presidents, while Prime Minister Harper got a deal in just 80 days. When will the Prime Minister finally stand up for New Brunswick forestry workers?
Yeah. Bunch of suits and ties making rules for everyone else.
And energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We on this side of the House have been working very hard in the interests of forestry workers and forestry companies here in Canada. We are working very hard to progress negotiations with the Americans. We are working very hard on value-added forestry. It is something that we are committed to continuing to do, including working with Irving Forest Products in New Brunswick. I would say, though, that on this side of the House, we are working very hard in the best interests of Canadians. We would expect elected officials across the board to be doing that, and Canadians are asking why the Leader of the Opposition will not get his security clearance.
Exactly. Because it's a gag order. Let's move on.
The honourable member from Prince Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 9 years, the NDP Liberals are not worth the cost. Just weeks after the U.S. hit Canada with a 14.5% tariff on softwood lumber, this Prime Minister dismissed its failures and the impact on Canadian workers and the impact of our forestry sector as small issues. Since the PM's comments in New York City, 2 sawmills in BC have closed, putting over 500 workers out of work. Canadian producers have paid $9 billion in tariffs to the U.S. From softwood lumber to Buy America. Why has this Prime Minister repeatedly backed down to the U.S.?
The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government always stands up for Canadian workers, and it always stands up for Canadian industry.
You're cutting 112,000 jobs because you're cap on emissions.
Well, the Conservative Party of Canada said to capitulate. When it came to supporting our steel and aluminum workers, we stood against those tariffs. We hit back hard. What did the other side say, Mr. Speaker? The Conservative Party of Canada said capitulate. When it comes to standing up for Canada's national security, we will always do that. But what about the Conservative Party of Canada? Mr. Speaker, their leader won't even get a security clearance to know what's really going on. What is it he's trying to hide? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.